afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
My name is Pam Tao Lee. I'm from California, San Francisco Bay Area. I am representing an organization in San Francisco called the Chinese Progressive Association. And I'm founder of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. So I am here sending a message from San Francisco, Chinatown to Paris. And we want climate justice and a systems change. Is that not true? Today, I am just so inspired to be in this room with you because of what I've been hearing about what's been going on in the negotiations. I'm understanding that there is a lot of negotiations around false solutions. Is that right? Yeah. So the reason why I'm so happy to be in here is because you reject these false solutions, that in your day-to-day work, you're organizing against these false solutions. The work that you're doing is to be able to build something else. And we're going to talk about that together today with you and your concrete practice and your visions for the future. And to be able to help us working together to move our work forward so that we can advance the work beyond where it is right now. Is that okay? To set the basis for that, we're going to have 4 speakers. And these 4 speakers will provide a general framework for your thinking, because I'm going to put you to work. The first speaker is Jose Bravo, and he's with the Just Transition Alliance. He's also a member of the Climate Justice Alliance, and you heard those words, alliance. Okay, embrace those words. And he's going to be able to talk a little bit about the history of the just transition work that he's been involved in. So listening to Jose, kind of like reflect on, what am I hearing? Is that reflected in the work that I'm doing? Do I want to do that work? Is that a pathway forward? He will be followed second by Goodwin Oyi Oho, who is from Friends of the Earth in Africa, Nigeria in particular. And Goodwin will share his perspectives in terms of the work done in the Global South. We'll be joined then thirdly with Alison Tate. Alison has been in meetings for the past 4 days. She's a representative of the International Trade Union Confederation, and she's going to be able to give us perspectives in terms of international labor movement and the things that she's heard over these past 4 days. And finally, we will have Ananda Lee Tan, who is with the Climate Justice Alliance. And Ananda is going to share with you these principles of just transition. Now, there are 6 principles, and it gives you the number. So as he's going on, you'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, what's that 6th one? Okay. So there are 6 principles that he's going to share with you. Again, I'd like you to reflect on what you hear from those 6 principles, how it connects to your work, right? And how might we deepen the work by these principles, or things that you can add to this perspective, okay? Then I'm going to put you to work with a question that I will pose to you, and you will discuss together, and we will share. So, does that work for you so far? So let me turn the mic over then now to Jose Bravo, who will give you a history of some of the work that he's done with the Just Transition Alliance.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Bravo, as Pam Tali said.
I'm the executive director to the Just Transition Alliance. The Just Transition Alliance has been in existence since 1997. And the way the Just Transition Alliance came together was that there was a visionary person by the name of Tony Mazzocchi in the United States that was thinking about just transition. He used to work, he's passed away, but he used to work with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. And many of us had been working in the environmental justice movement for probably 10 years before that as a movement after the first People of Color Environmental Justice Summit. And Tony came to us and said, look, we are working with the Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers Union. We make oil, we also make chemicals, we make weapons, everything from conventional weapons to nuclear weapons, and they also are part of maintaining and keeping nuclear reactors for energy. So Tony thought at some point the workers came together and said, what we make is not sustainable. There's things that we make that should not be on Earth, that should not be used, that should not go out into the population. So they said, we see the writing on the wall. And as workers in those industries, we need to transition into healthy, green, sustainable, and adequate economies that would take into consideration us workers. Tony had, and the OCAW, let's go to the OCAW, Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, had experimented with mainstream green groups, Sierra Club, Greenpeace, and there wasn't a necessary an agreement on how to work together on labor and environmental issues. And when people in OCAW heard about this environmental justice movement, one of the things that they said was, we are natural allies. Why are we natural allies? Because as that sign says, they are frontline workers and we are the fence line community. What happens inside the plant will not be held by a chain link fence. If there's an accident that kills workers, the communities are affected as well. So as a result, Pam was one of the founders too, and early on, and we came together and started having dialogues. The first dialogue that we had was interesting because labor said to us, if we're going to come together and have a Just Transition Alliance, you have to not have mutual collaborative agreement where we would invite them to our actions, they would invite us to our actions, but we would work together on removing the wedge between workers and environment. So we decided to work on 5 sites around the United States. We chose sites that had issues with labor, unsigned collective bargaining contracts, and environmental justice community action and work right outside the fence line. And as a result, we became very successful in bringing workers together And one key thing that I think is very important is that we had to dismantle the myth that workers are not interested in the environment and that community people are not interested in union workers. So what we developed was a curriculum. It was called Work and Environment instead of Work versus Environment. And this curriculum, we did a team of trainers that went around nationally with workers and did trainings in communities and to workers. I think if I could just say, one of the most important things, as unions, they had meetings around worker health and safety, and those meetings usually happened inside the plants. But what we asked of the workers was that when they talk about worker health and safety, they come to the community and have that conversation. So the community listens to the issues that are happening inside the plant around health and safety. And then they both, community and workers, work together. As you can imagine, the managers at some of these plants, at Exxon, at Chevron, at Shell, at DuPont, were very, how should I say it, scared to have workers talking to communities directly, especially those communities that had been doing actions against some of their issues. So I just want to mention that as how some of that got started in the United States. And I also want to mention that whenever we talk about a just transition, at least us, we cannot separate the workers from the community. We believe that if you don't have the workers as part of a just transition in a community setting, then you're missing part of your natural allies who could be working with you. And we also look at this whole thing as a system of production. So if it's a chemical that's affecting the community, then we see where the raw materials come from, where it's manufactured, where it's put into a product, where it's sold again sometimes, and then where it's dumped. We have to be equitable and responsible at all levels of production and all levels of that life cycle. Without being responsible at all levels of that life cycle, then we're missing somebody. So sometimes you see things like a video that shows a product that's a cell phone that was made somewhere with using labor that is being exploited. But the materials to make that cell phone had to come from somewhere too. And those materials would usually come from communities where there's mines, where there's impact, and where there's poverty, and where there's, in many instances, despair because of the way that these mining companies run business. So we have to look at the whole thing. And now what we used to call it cradle to grave. But what we call it now is, and the way we need to think about it, is cradle to cradle. Because if we don't call it and see it as a cradle to cradle, then we're just going to be having to use resources, more resources, and throwing things away. And as many of us know, the issue of what is being called the type of production where you throw things away comes out of the Second World War, but that was thought about so that economies could rise and economies could get well. And ultimately, we have to stop thinking about that. We have to think locally, source locally. It does not make any sense to us to have things globalized. Communities should have the right to source locally and understand that if you are part of the global structure of things, I could be sending things I'm in California, so I could be sending a machine that's going to be recycled to somewhere in India by somebody else that is, and we do not believe in what we call, at that point, shifting the burden, right? We have to be responsible for what we produce, and we have to be responsible at the whole cycle of these products and the whole cycle of issue. So again, that would be my talk today, and thank you very much for inviting the Just Transition Alliance and the Climate Justice Alliance.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Godwin Uyojo, Director of Environmental Rights Action, Friends of the Earth, Nigeria. I will start by saying that each and every one of us should be involved in the Just Transition Alliance because it is the way forward. Right now, I strongly believe that the world is struggling, facing a problem of what is called the conflict of development. That conflict of development has to do whether to tackle the question, do we continue the pathway of fossil fuel civilization as we know it, or do mankind needs to retract and follow another model? That is just the question. So all the noise that you hear about the COP, this ought to be the ultimate. And so within this context of just transition, the problem of energy security, the perception, the notion, the way it's defined is problematic and is causing a lot of discomfort in the South. For example, energy security to industrialized countries, to countries of the North, simply means energy supply unhindered. Energy security means continuous flow of resources, continuous flow of energy unhindered, not minding militarization of the pipelines, of the oil installations. So for the South, for Nigeria, for Africa, energy security as defined by the North simply means dispossession. It means poverty. It means increasing conflict at the site of extraction. So this model cannot continue. And that is why in Nigeria, because of the oil exploitation that has continued for years since 1956, it has yielded nothing but conflict, conflict, conflict. So we need to move away from this system and move towards a decarbonized energy system. The second point I want to propose, which is also very strong, is that today, from within this COP, within this period, there is a new movement, a shift towards energy transition from fossil fuel to renewable sources of energy. That is no longer news. What is news is that while the COP is struggling and fighting over Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, trying to hide historical responsibility, a new movement has emerged, and that is zero annex. Annex 0 has come to stay. And that is formed by individuals, communities, countries who will agree to leave the oil, leave the coal, leave the gas in the ground and move towards a new transition. So that Annex 0 is emanating from the grassroots. And it's a donation, it's a contribution to this debate. And this is important. And I want to underscore this, how it all started. It started with Ken Saro-Wiwa, talking about the Ken Saro-Wiwa legacy. The Ogonians were persecuted for just daring to stand up, to speak against share over the atrocities committed in Nigeria. Soon too soon, Ken Saro-Wiwa was arrested with all his colleagues, wounded, and you know the history, they were hanged. After the killing of Ken and his 8 compatriots, 2,000 Ogonis were to lay down their life in just trying to speak against Share. But what was the legacy? Since 1993, Share remained expelled from Ogoniland. In spite of military power, in spite of community power that they have, in spite of the money that they have not been able to defeat the people's power. 28,000 barrels of oil per day since 1993 is locked in Nigeria, in Ogoniland. And that is the transition we are talking about. So it is important for us to understand this. To decarbonize was very important to follow the trend of the debate. But sometimes direct action is also very important. The third point I want to make is that the African group has keyed into this process. And they have come up with the African Renewable Energy Initiative that will ensure energy transition away from monopolistic entities, a decentralized form of energy. And that is what we are working with at the moment. Organizing communities, building institutions, setting up how they can use renewable energy. And we do sincerely hope that developed countries will provide the finance that is necessary for this just transition. And so as we speak in the communities and in places that we go to, there is a readiness, there is hunger towards a new development system. And this is very important. A system that will be done in a way that communities are able to produce and distribute energy without having to depend on shared total chevron. And that is key. So they become co-producers, co-suppliers, bear the risk as well as benefits. And that is the just transition that we seek. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alison Tate, and indeed I'm very happy to be here representing the International Trade Union Confederation. I can see some of our members here in the audience, at least from France and Australia. I hope maybe there are others that I didn't see. And maybe many of you are members of trade unions that are affiliated to national trade union centers. They're a part of the ITUC. For those who are not so sure, where we represent the Global Trade Union body representing 180 million workers from 165 countries. Certainly, I can share from the last few days of the discussions that we had as a part of the Citizens Summit, but I want to also link that to this part of the conversation which has been generated amongst our affiliates in many countries, in many different spaces. At the national level, regionally, in many different fora, and also internationally through the kinds of spaces that we've been able to facilitate, I guess, in previous years, not only here at the climate negotiations context, but in real life, out there, back in our workplaces, with our Global Union Federation colleagues in sectoral levels. But there's really a lot going on, and I'll try to capture some of it, not so much in the practical examples, although I hope we get time to come back to that, but in some of the principles of where we've got to, and what we know needs to happen. Because for sure, Some of you will have heard the slogan, right? There are no jobs on a dead planet. Have people heard it? Yeah. So it's much more than a slogan, right? At the back. It's much more than a slogan. We have to turn this into a reality. And for sure, it's people, workers, communities who are on the front lines of climate change. But we know that if the transition is in terms of dignified work, but a dignified life. So certainly, the trade union movement globally, over previous decades to now, is coming to terms with, at different moments and in different ways and different political settings, but is coming to terms with what it means for their role in this crisis. Perhaps more than any other problem that humanity has faced. Climate change confronts us with the reality of our own interdependence and the need for solidarity. Again, let me say, this is not a slogan, this is about solidarity in action. And we know that communities and countries need to work together for a better future, a future that delivers economic justice, as well as environmental justice and intergenerational justice. So when we talk about jobs, we're not just talking about the jobs that exist today, but what is the transition to the jobs of tomorrow? And we're not only talking about jobs in energy. Of course, fossil fuel-based jobs, the future of the energy systems is not going to look like it is today. And future generations will work in energy jobs, but they won't look like they do today. So we have to understand that a zero-carbon world is possible, but the kind of industrial transformation it's going to take, and on the scale it's going to take, and the time frame that we need to deliver that, is really greater than any of the challenges we've seen in the past. So underpinning the complexity of all these interrelated elements, underpinning the complexity of what's being negotiated out there at Le Bourget these 2 weeks, is that we must have a plan to decarbonize. We have to have a plan to reach a zero-carbon future. Otherwise, what we will see is a future that is replicating greater and greater catastrophic loss of life and of livelihoods. So what we want, essentially, through a just transition, is we want plans at a workplace level, at a community level, at an industry level, within regions, within countries, at a national level. And of course, what we want out of the text of this agreement by the end of this week is a recognition that a just transition is a way to operationalize this agreement. If we're going to get anything that's of value to linking to the social consequences of climate change, we believe we need that language in there. And we have been fighting for a just transition and references to decent work within the context of the agreement itself. What does that mean? You know, language in the agreement, what it really means is actually, and what our campaign is about after the COP from 2016 on, is that dialogue exists for people to participate in planning within their communities and their workplaces. The right to know what their companies are doing to reduce emissions, the right to know what their governments are doing, and the right to participate. So everyone has a job to do in that sense, to make the economic and social transformation that we need to sustain our world. And this is what we've been talking about out at the Citizen Summit the last 2 days, building on those kinds of conversations that have happened in workplaces and communities and different industries, with unions, right? Within unions. So for us, if that doesn't happen, if we cannot find the space to have a dialogue with companies, with communities, build those alliances across social movements, with Indigenous people, with the women's movement, with the peace movement, with development actors, with the big development NGOs, and with locally based actors in these kinds of transformations, if we don't have that, really, friends, if we don't have that, we're going to find increasing community conflict over access to energy and to resources. And the social dislocation is like nothing we've seen to date. So trade unions are looking at what our responsibilities are to ensure that that's not the outcome. We want a just transition, right? That's the meaning. So I would like to just finish that kind of setting with a number of points that we've come up with. And if you go to the ITUC website, a little advertisement, take a look there. There's the references I'm about to mention are in English, Spanish, and French on the website under the ITUC climate pages. Check out the Facebook pages as well. There's a lot of exchange and interaction going on there. But I'll just mention what a just transition looks like. But if you remember, it's based basically on a dialogue, right? Social dialogue as the basis for developing plans. And what we say is we are choosing to leave no one behind in a zero carbon world. It's a big challenge for us to overcome the current state of politics in many countries and within many communities where there is a sense that we're not all in the same boat, that we're not all on the same planet, that we have different interests, and this is what we have to really overcome. So I'm going to just talk briefly about what it means to ensure that there's a managed transition, that people can participate. We see that unions, employers, civil society and governments need to be in dialogue and to scale up the action to ensure that new and decent and green jobs are created in the new kind of economy we have an opportunity to build. And that's one based on decent work, based on investments in social protection, in infrastructure, not just the notion of traditional infrastructure, but social infrastructure that really delivers a different kind of world. So here are the points I want to read out. We say that a just transition will invest in jobs. It will invest in decent work opportunities in sectors which reduce emissions and help communities adapt to climate change. Just transition is based on a guarantee, which is a fundamental human right, to social protection and human rights. To invest in community renewal, to gain the hope and trust of regions and townships and communities at the forefront of energy transition, industrial transformation, and of climate impacts. To support the kind of innovation and technology sharing to enable a rapid transformation of energy, of manufacturing, along with all the other economic sectors. I can't go into all of them, but you know them, right? Transport, energy access, service development, service delivery, and the involvement of workers and communities in sectoral plans for transforming megacities, the way forestry is conducted, the way agriculture is conducted. We're talking about a fundamental human transformation, right? Societal transformation. But we're also talking about formalizing jobs, addressing the informal economy, and ensuring that the rescue and restoring of communities and building resilience to climate disasters. We're talking about being based on social dialogue. I've mentioned it a couple of times. That's with all relevant parties. That means reflected in collective bargaining agreements between workers and employers. So it's again, the responsibility of unions to take that up. We need to be talking about skills development, reskilling. and the monitoring of those agreements that make it real. And finally, to respect the contributions that workers in the fossil fuel industries have made in the past and provide them with a sense of security. That means income support, or retraining and redeployment opportunities, as well as secure pensions for older workers. That's a part of what we discussed over the weekend, and very happy to speak in more detail. Thank you.
Really quickly, I want to make sure that one tidbit of information. The Just Transition Alliance about 7 years ago did a calculation on what it would take in the United States, how much money to transfer from a carbon economy away from a carbon economy, and it was about $3.8 trillion. Can somebody tell me what the war in Iraq and Afghanistan has cost? 3.6. So the priorities, again, for countries need to be aligned with the necessities of its people. And ultimately, the war, we could have not had war and had been well on our way into transforming away from a carbon economy.
Thanks, Pam. So I'll close out the panel before we get into a group discussion. My name is Ananda Litan. I'm here with the Climate Justice Alliance. We are a North American alliance of frontline communities, African American, Indigenous, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, and working class white communities that are on the front lines of climate change. But they're not just on the front lines of the storms, the floods, the droughts. They're also the communities whose backyards are sited with the majority of the coal power plants, the oil refineries, all the climate polluting industries causing this ecological crisis. We came together in the lead up to the Copenhagen COP about 6 years ago, at a time when we felt that the voices of these frontline communities were not being represented in international fora. We had a lot of well-meaning civil society, a lot of allies who are forging forward with the climate fight, but the voices of those on the front lines of the crisis, those that are not only on the front lines of the crisis, but have been cultivating solutions to combat this crisis, to survive, but not just survive and preserve their cultures, but also to seek alternative economic means of meeting the material needs in their communities. That these voices needed to come together. And so in the US, we started a process of dialogue between communities to talk about what is the path forward as a movement. And that's what I'm going to share a bit with you today is some of what guided our dialogue. Because what we felt was that while campaigns are guided by goals and objectives and strategies and tactics, and a lot of what civil society cultivates as its practice, that movements are actually built by a whole different set of criteria. Movements are guided by vision, but movements are also guided by principles, protocols, and practices. And having those deep sets of values that we can align ourselves along was what was going to get us in the right formation to step forward as a movement and talk about things such as just transition. So in the last 6 years, the Climate Justice Alliance has really come into its own. And part of what we're doing today is running a campaign called the Our Power Campaign. Communities United for a Just Transition. A just transition to what? What we're describing as our vision is a vision of local living economies. Local living and linked economies. Because economies cannot be isolationist. They need to stand in solidarity locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. We were fortunate enough that we had many who had walked before us, including Jose, Pam, members of the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Southwest Network on Economies and the Farm Workers, the Asia Pacific Environmental Network. Many environmental justice grassroots groups had come together as part of the Just Transition Alliance, and they drafted a set of common principles to guide their work. And I'm going to quickly go through them because, like I said before, it's sometimes useful. And I know I was having this conversation with an organizer a couple of days ago as to what use is our principles to movements. I would say now more than ever, whether it's dialogue between communities and workers, dialogue in broader civil society, are coming together as a movement and demanding very concrete demands of where the investments should go, where the solutions lie, what kind of systems change shall define our pathways out of this ecological crises. All of these have to be guided by a set of alignment principles. And we're fortunate enough that some of our veterans took this work forward a couple of dozen years ago. So to start off with the just transition principles, the first principle that was defined was that workers, indigenous communities, frontline communities, and I'm going to paraphrase them. Our sisters here have written up the principles for people to look at later. That all communities and workers have the right to clean air, clean food, clean water, healthy, safe workplaces, and healthy, safe schools and communities. That these are fundamental rights that should guide all economic transition. That these are really immovable. These are common and inalienable rights of all people and all creation on this planet. Secondly, there is no conflict between economic health and environmental health. The health of our communities, the clean air, the clean water, and a sustainable economy really are intertwined. When you even break down the words, ecology and economy, the roots of those words, economy is the management of home, ecology is the study of home. And the management of our home needs to be guided by the study of our home. Sorry about that, I'll get closer to the mic. Finally, on that note, like our sister said, not only are there no jobs on a dead planet, in order to make the road to where we want to go, we have to ensure that we can all make a living on a living planet. And that those economic transitions are defined by jobs, by new economic systems that really work towards restoring the health of our communities and the ecosystems that our communities rely upon. The third principle was this was written in a time when the global social justice movement was really coming to its fore. And in the face of corporate globalization, global policies, trade policies, corporate neoliberal trade policies, we need to really form a countervailing force where not only our movements, but the solutions we seek are defined through mutuality and solidarity at local, regional, national, and international levels. So that is the third principle, the one of mutuality and solidarity between all the communities and the solutions we seek. The fourth principle is that those policies must be inclusive of the voices and democratic decision-making of communities and workers. That at all levels of governance, from municipal to the global compacts, unless our collective voices are represented, those compacts, those agreements, those policies shall be meaningless. That while we fight for the solutions, while we fight for the systems that oppress us, we need to ensure that all these decision-making arenas and forums are accessible to the democratic representation of our communities and workers. The fifth principle is at all costs, because there's going to be costs. There is costs, and as we make these shifts, and this was a principle that really came out of close dialogue with unions back in the day, that none of these costs should be borne by those workers and communities most impacted. Whether it's workers in the mining sector, or in the power plant sector, or in the agriculture sector, or any sector that needs to transition to a new model of sustainability, out of what I call the dig, burn, drive, dump economy. We need to ensure that that transition, the infrastructure investments, are paid for by those most responsible for building these unsustainable systems. And finally, workers and communities should always have the right to challenge and hold accountable the status quo, those systems, those institutions that oppress us. The governments, the war machines, the corporations that are destroying this planet need to be held accountable, and we need to institute legal frameworks where workers and communities continually hold these institutions and can hold these institutions accountable. So with that said, we're going to transition to, and Pam will describe, some dialogue But just want to say that these principles, take these as a set of principles that can be adapted and used and to redefine everywhere you go. Because these are supposed to be living, breathing principles. In your community, they need to be made appropriate. But ultimately, what they hopefully will help us to do is then define where we're headed.
Thank you, everybody. Let's give them a hand.